The Black Codes were laws passed on the state and local level in the United States, but mostly in the South, to limit the basic human rights and civil liberties of African Americans. Even though the U.S. Constitution originally discriminated against African Americans, as other persons in both northern and southern states passed discriminatory legislation from the early 19th century, the term Black Codes is used most often to refer to legislation passed by southern states at the end of the Civil War to control the labor movements and activities of newly freed slaves. In Texas, the 11th legislature produced these codes in 1866. The intent of the legislation was to reaffirm the inferior position that slaves and free blacks had held in antebellum Texas, and to regulate black labor. The codes reflected the unwillingness of white Texans to accept blacks as equals, and also their fears that freed men would not work unless coerced. Thus the codes continued legal discrimination between whites and blacks. The legislature, when it amended the 1856 Penal Code, emphasized the continuing line between whites and blacks by defining all individuals with 1/8 or more African blood as persons of color, subject to special provisions in the law. The Black Codes, enacted immediately after the American Civil War, though varying from state to state, were all intended to secure a steady supply of cheap labor, and all continued to assume the inferiority of the freed slaves. The Black Codes had their roots in the slave codes that had formerly been in effect. The premise behind chattel slavery in America was that slaves were property, and, as such, they had few or no legal rights. The slave codes, in their many loosely defined forms, were seen as effective tools against slave unrest, particularly as a hedge against uprisings and runaways. Enforcement of slave codes also varied, but corporal punishment was widely and harshly employed. Expansion, 1830 to 1860. As the abolitionist movement gained force and escape programs for slaves such as the Underground Railroad expanded, concern about blacks heightened among some whites in the North. Article 13 of Indiana's 1851 Constitution stated, "No Negro, or mulatto, shall come into or settle in the state after the adoption of this Constitution." The 1848 Constitution of Illinois led to one of the harshest black code systems in the nation until the Civil War. The Illinois Black Code of 1853 extended a complete prohibition against black immigration into the state. All the slave states passed laws banning the marriage of whites and blacks, so-called anti-miscegenation laws, as did several new free states, including Indiana, Illinois and Michigan. Indiana and Illinois shared borders with slave states, and the southern populations of these states had cultures that shared more values with the South across the Ohio River than the northern populations. In several states, the Black Codes were either incorporated into or required by their state constitutions, many of which were rewritten in the 1940s. Post-Civil War. After the abolition of slavery by the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, all former slave states adopted new black codes. During 1865, every southern state passed black codes that restricted the freed men, who were emancipated but not yet full citizens. While they pursued readmission to the Union, the southern states provided freedmen with limited second-class civil rights and no voting rights. Southern plantation owners feared that they would lose their land. Having convinced themselves that slavery was justified, planters feared African Americans wouldn't work without coercion. The Black Codes were an attempt to control them and to ensure they did not claim social equality. The Black Codes granted African Americans certain rights, such as legalized marriage, ownership of property, and limited access to the courts. But the Black Codes denied them the rights to testify against whites, to serve on juries, or in state militias, or to vote. And in response, the planters' demands that the freed people be required to work on the plantations, the Black Codes declared that those who failed to sign yearly labor contracts could be arrested and hired out to white landowners. Some states limited the occupations open to African Americans and barred them from acquiring land, and others provided that judges could assign African American children to work for their former owners without the consent of their parents. The following are detailed elements of the Black Codes of Mississippi and South Carolina, Mississippi, Negroes must make annual contracts for their labor in writing. If they should run away from their tasks, they forfeited their wages for the year. Whenever it was required of them, they must present licenses in a town from the mayor, elsewhere from a member of the board of police of the beat, citing their places of residence and authorizing them to work. Fugitives from labor were to be arrested and carried back to their employers. $5 a head in mileage would be allowed such Negro catchers. It was made a misdemeanor, punishable with fine or imprisonment, to persuade a freedman to leave his employer or to feed the runaway. Minors were to be apprenticed, if males until they were 21, if females until 18 years of age. Such corporal punishment as a father would administer to a child might be inflicted upon apprentices by their masters. Vagrants were to be fined heavily, and if they could not pay the sum, they were to be hired out to service until the claim was satisfied. Negroes might not carry knives or firearms unless they were licensed so to do. It was an offense, to be punished by a fine of $50 and imprisonment for 30 days, to give or sell intoxicating liquors to a Negro. When Negroes could not pay the fines and costs after legal proceedings, they were to be hired at public outcry by the sheriff to the lowest bidder. South Carolina. In South Carolina, persons of color contracting for service were to be known as servants, and those with whom they contracted as masters. On farms, the hours of labor would be from sunrise to sunset daily, except on Sunday. The Negroes were to get out of bed at dawn. Time lost would be deducted from their wages, as would be the cost of food during absence from sickness. Absentees on Sunday must return to the plantation by sunset. House servants were to be at call at all hours of the day and night, on all days of the week. They must be especially civil and polite to their masters' families and guests, and they in return would receive gentle and kind treatment. Corporal and other punishment was to be administered only upon order of the district judge or other civil magistrate. A vagrant law of some severity was enacted to keep the Negroes from roaming the roads and living the lives of beggars and thieves. The Black Codes outraged public opinion in the North because it seemed the South was creating a form of quasi-slavery to evade the results of the war. After winning large majorities in the 1866 elections, the Republicans put the South under military rule. They held new elections in which the freedmen could vote. Suffrage was also expanded to poor whites. The new governments repealed all the Black Codes. They were never reenacted.